Hey, everybody, this is Jon Sherwood, host of the Unpolished Church podcast. Thanks again for joining us. If you enjoy this show or find it helpful, please share with a friend, like and subscribe, drop a comment below. Today, what I wanted to do as I'm outside of my normal office and venue space, on a writing retreat, actually working on a book set to release next fall, I wanted to talk a little bit today about what is church. Obviously, for us here in our local context, we have transitioned to this microchurch network modality and model. And as we talk about this with other people, often I have to start with the question, what is church? How do we define church? What is it that we believe church is, and what do we believe church is not? This is crucial for anybody that is interested in learning more, experimenting with, or adapting to any sort of new modality beyond just a traditional church model. We have to start with, what do we think church is? And that can be defined in a lot of different ways. Is two people who are friends having coffee in the park, is that church? Why or why not? Does a sermon have to be preached by a preacher in order for it to be church? Why or why not? Do we have to celebrate the Eucharist? Do we have to take the Lord's table and partake in communion for it to be church? Why or why not? These kinds of questions and how we answer them, our convictions around them, will determine what we are going to practice in terms of the modalities of how we express church as a gathering of believers in Jesus. Now, of course, the term church in the New Testament, which occurs over 100 times, is a translation from the Greek word ekklesia, which literally just means gathering or assembly. And so anytime Christians gathered in the early church, in the early first century, they called it the gathering. And commonly this was to celebrate and remember the Lord, his death and resurrection, to partake in the Lord's Supper. And this would often be done on the first day of the week, as it was commonly celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, which happened on the first day of the week. And so that has been the historic mode and model in the New Testament of Christians gathering, and they called it church, ekklesia, the gathering. But today, 2,000 years later, church has many, many different layers and meaning and traditions and rituals. Some of them really great and helpful. Some of them may not be. And so for us, when we gather, and as we started thinking about moving into this microchurch, house church, small gathering expression, we started to have to peel back and really uncover and redefine and reassess, what do we think church is? And so I wanted to share a little bit today of how we have navigated those kinds of questions and some of the places we've arrived, not as a indicator of this is where everyone must arrive, but hopefully to offer some appropriate questions that every body of Christians have to wrestle with if they are going to entertain or experiment with anything different than what they have always been doing. I think we've got to go back to the most beginning questions of why. And so for us, what is church is one of these foundational questions. This has been a bit of an evolution for us. We have kind of navigated over time, over several years, with iterations as we struggle with and wrestle and come back and re-wrestle with these kinds of questions. But for us, I think one of the fundamental ways that we define church is that we think that it's comprised of three primary things. Now, again, this is somewhat arbitrary. This isn't a dogmatic. This is the once and for all definition of church, but this is where we have landed at this time. We define church as it needs to contain three things, or be aimed at three things for us to consider it church. One is lordship, the other is mission, and the other is maturity. And these three things, we believe, embody a well-rounded perspective of what the New Testament gathering was doing, aiming at, and trying to be as an alternative community, an alternative society to the world at large. And so the lordship of Jesus simply means to surrender, to submit, to be in an ongoing process of repentance and transformation, to become like Jesus, to be with Jesus. Maturity is simply that same process, that we would continually try to lean into and allow God to do his formative work in us, to transform us more and more into the likeness of Jesus, transforming us from one glory to another. All of these New Testament passages that indicate that our Christian faith and our life in community is not static. And if it is static, then something's severely broken. But that our process of being Jesus followers in community is that we would become like Jesus together. Now, that's not a linear thing. It doesn't happen in a straight line. There are setbacks, there are pitfalls, but our aim is that church should be a place where I, as a Christian, as a Jesus follower, and committing myself in community with other people to become like Jesus. Now, of course, the lordship of Jesus includes things like worship, that we would celebrate, that we would praise, that we would be with Jesus together in community, that we would pray to Jesus together, that we would listen and discern the Spirit of Jesus together, that we would be with Jesus. This is how we encapsulate this idea under the term lordship. Maturity is this idea of becoming like Jesus, transforming more into his likeness. And of course, mission is another component that we say is needed to be aimed at to qualify as a church or a microchurch in our frameworks. And that mission, of course, is Jesus' mission to make all things new, the renewal of all things, to bring forth new creation. This includes seeking and saving the lost, bringing the good news, the gospel to people who have not heard it, as well as bringing alleviation to suffering, bringing justice to oppression, bringing service to those in need. In all ways, the mission of Jesus to love the world that is dying and hurting and lost, to bring salve to the wound of the world, to create the new creation. This is the mission that he is inviting and calling us to participate in, to join in with God. And this is what it means for us to be church. If a gathering of Christians is not aiming at all three of these, or maybe only aiming at one, we wouldn't, in our frameworks, qualify it as a church or a microchurch. In other words, two friends getting coffee that are believers might share in becoming like Jesus together as they teach and admonish, as they encourage, but they may not worship, or they may not remember the Lord's Supper together, or they may not be on mission, and so on and so forth. For us, our ideal way that we're defining what we call a microchurch minimum, or sometimes referred to as minimal ecclesiology. Ecclesiology, coming from that word ecclesia, just means the study of the gathering of Christians, or the study of church. So for us, what it takes for a minimum level for a group of Christians to be considered a microchurch in our network is not just that they gather or meet, but rather that they gather and meet with some specific aims in mind. And this is lordship, mission, and maturity. Another way to say it is to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do as Jesus did. And that as a gathering of Christians, a group of Christians, whether it's 2 or 200 or 2,000 or 20 in a living room or in a great stadium or auditorium in some venue, whatever the gathering size is, the aim of that gathering is these three things. And for us, in our network, in our constructs, in our frameworks, we call that church. If it's devoid of those or isn't aiming at those, it might be good and beneficial. It might offer something really great to the Christians or to the world around it, but we don't necessarily call it a microchurch. And so as I've been talking about microchurches with other people who are coming from traditional churches or traditional church expressions, often the question is, or even people who are, in currently like autonomous house churches. Many times those house churches, they gather, they celebrate the Lord's Supper, they encourage one another, but they may not be on mission. They may not be reaching out to their neighbors or impacting the community around them or serving the poor, or really there's no growth or spreading of the gospel in any real noticeable way. And oftentimes people will come and say, well, how do we address this? How do we fix this? How do we get our house church to grow? Or how do we get our traditional church to also incorporate or lean into small church expressions? And my response to that is usually something more fundamental, to say, hey, before you get there, you have to define for yourselves, hopefully through the power of the Spirit, the leading of the Spirit, and the conviction informed by the authority of the Scriptures, what is church? If you can't define that clearly, it's a little difficult. In fact, I would say it's very difficult to have a clear aim at what it is you're trying to accomplish when you try to implement any sort of change or adjustment or pivot in any way. If you pivot and you don't know where you're going to, you're just pivoting aimlessly and likely just going to go in circles. And so for us, this is how we have wrestled with over the last several years this minimal ecclesiology. What does it take at minimum for something to be a microchurch as we understand it? And for us, this is where we've landed currently, the lordship, mission, and maturity ideology, that when a group of or a gathering of Christians is aiming at these three things, we say, you are a microchurch. Now, in a later episode, we will talk about the leadership and the leadership structures of those microchurches, what we call microchurch pastors, the poimains there in Ephesians 4. How does that arrive? How do you train those? What ecosystem do they live in with a larger leadership structure, given that their microchurch is a part of a network and not just an autonomous microchurch? Because there are different ways to approach this. But thank you again so much for being a part of this journey with us. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them below. And we look forward to being able to serve God, to love Jesus, to be with him, to become like him, and to join him in his mission to do as he did.